Okay, it's a couple of minutes past 12. We've got about 12 attendees have just popped in, so I think we should make a start. Is everyone in agreement? Excellent. So hello and welcome to today's CIPR event, which is on leading the way in climate change in the public sector. I'm Holly Bremner, I'm going to be your chair today. I'm Head of Communications at the Construction Industry Training Board, and I'm also Secretary of the CIPR's Local Public Services Group. Now, climate change impacts all of us. It's something that a lot of us are talking about at the moment, particularly after COP26, which has certainly pushed climate change to the fore. But well in advance of COP26, there were more than 300 councils who declared a climate emergency, along with many public sector organisations who are all taking action to reduce their own carbon emissions with the support of their communities. Now, my former authority, which was Rutland County Council, I know they'd undertaken a lot of engagement prior to me leaving with residents to try and understand what the challenge was, how people felt about climate change and how we're going to address it together. And I think today's conversation will encompass some of those areas. I'm joined today by Dave, who is the Associate Director of Communications and Engagement for the Met Office. Hi, Dave. And hiya. So Dave is going to be focusing on the conversation around climate change and the evidence and about how that promotes action from individuals. Is that right? And how we change that conversation and shape that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Dave Britton. I'm the Associate Director of Comms and Engagement at the Met Office, the UK's National Weather and Climate Service. We undertake huge amounts of research into climate change, and one of the things we then need to do is make sure that we communicate that climate science and climate information accurately so that people are well informed and therefore can take action. I'll be talking a little bit more about that.
Brilliant. We've also got Louise Morton, who's Communications Manager for Surrey County Council. Hi, Louise.
Hi, thank you. We were one of the councils that declared a climate emergency back in July 2019, but we only just published our delivery plan. So we've had 18 months of trying to talk to residents about climate change without having a concrete plan in place. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we've navigated through that, along with the pandemic at the same time.
Excellent, look forward to hearing about that. And then finally, we're joined by behaviour change expert Dominic Ridley-Moy, who's from the Behaviour Change Network. Dom, do you want to talk about what you're going to be talking about today?
So I'm just going to say very briefly, so I will talk a little bit about how we can use behavioural insights, thinking about people's behaviours and using behavioural frameworks to have a think about how we can shift people's actions to do the right thing when it comes to climate change and what areas of their lives they can focus on.
Excellent. So the plan today is that Dave's going to go first, followed by Louise, then Dominic. We can do 3 presentations and then we're going to have questions and answers at the end. For the questions and answer session, please feel free to put your questions in the chat or put your hand up and we'll activate your microphones. You'll be able to speak. So without any further ado, let's kick off and hand over to Dave from the Met Office.
Thank you. I shall just share my screen and then we will crack on. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, I'm Dave Britton. I'm the and we're going to talk a little bit about how we can support people get climate ready. But what I'm going to start by doing is talk a little bit around climate science and what that means, both for the world but also for the UK. Because I think it's really important that as communicators, as PRs working in our organisations, that if we are going to provide the strategic action or the strategic advice necessary for boards to take action, that we need to build our own knowledge and understanding of climate change. So I'm going to start there. Excuse me as I talk a little bit about some of the science, and then talk on about how we then move that forward in terms of the communications elements of how we take that forward. So first I'm going to start with, what is the challenge of climate change? What are we talking about here and how do we make it real for people? So current levels of atmospheric CO2 are absolutely unprecedented in more than 800,000 years. And it's that CO2 in our atmosphere, along with other greenhouse gases, that is leading to the warming we have seen in the atmosphere, as well as many other indicators that we've seen in terms of climate change. Since the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen by more than 45%. And it is, again, that is causing the warming that we've been seeing. But how is that being materialized on the ground, if you like? Well, global average temperature difference, this graph really shows, I think, really starkly, the warming we've seen since 1850 or pre-industrial levels, and also the really alarming warming we've probably seen in the last 40 years, really since the 80s, where we've seen this relentless rise in global temperatures. And it's really important to recognize that warming is not even around the globe either. So the poles are warming faster than equator, but essentially the northern hemisphere, where clearly we all are, is also warming faster than the northern hemisphere. But what does that really mean for the UK? I think it's really important as we start to think about how we engender change and an understanding amongst our audiences. So looking at here, we're looking at kind of some of the state of the UK climate back in 2020, and we're doing this again as we come to the end of 2021. But a whole range of indicators, not just in temperature, but across rainfall. So it was the 5th wettest year on record, and it was the wettest February. February 2020 was the wettest February ever recorded. We saw longer leaf seasons in trees and longer growing seasons. And also 9 of the 10 warmest years for the UK near coast sea surface temperature have occurred since 2002, sorry. And we saw one of the least snowy years on record. And all of these are indicators of our changing climate. But those can be quite abstract for people. And I think it's really often, it's often said we don't experience climate change. As we sit on this planet or we sit at home, we don't experience climate change. What we experience is extreme weather. And we've seen real instances of extreme weather increasing across the planet, but also in the UK. So through 2021, we saw the Siberian heat wave, the European flooding in July 2021 with 200 deaths across Germany and other Central European countries. And then the North American heat wave, or the heat dome, and we saw record-breaking temperatures in Canada, 49.6 degrees Celsius recorded in June 2021. So we're seeing these more and more frequently across the planet, not just globally, but as I said, in the UK as well. So heat waves in 2020, most significant heat wave we'd seen in the last 60 years. And research shows that by 2050, hot summers could happen, like the one we saw back in 2020, could happen every other year. As already said, February 2020 was the wettest February on record, with widespread flooding. Storm Cara brought a month's worth of rainfall in just 18 hours across West Yorkshire, and actually wildfires as well, so 5 times more likely by the end of the century than they were at the beginning of the century. So we're really seeing massive changes in our climate. But what is it that we can do about it? And of course, at COP26, there was a lot of talk of both mitigation and adaptation, and also how far we were going towards the 2015 Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has kind of said we want to keep below 2 degrees, we want to limit to 1.5. And what is the trajectory we want to see? Well, we're already past 1 degree above pre-industrial levels in terms of our global temperatures. And to achieve that 1.5, we need to see greenhouse gases peak as soon as possible. But then we need to make sure that we're achieving a long-term approach to our net zero emissions by the middle of this century. And many people have been, many different organizations are still debating this place around 2050, 2030. What is the target we need to get to for our net zero ambitions? But mitigation is just one thing. This is about limiting further warming. We are already committed to some warming. And I think it's really important that for our audiences, we're clear about the fact that we are already committed to some warming and some changing, already locked in effects of our changing climate. So we'll already see those ongoing impacts that we've already seen, such as those I've already described, such as flooding, but then also the committed impacts that we're already going to continue to see before we even start to limit future warming. So what's our role as communicators? Well, I think at the very beginning, I said it's really important that we are able to clearly communicate the science, and the role in the Met Office has been really about changing the objective or changing the narrative for us around climate change. Previously, we very much saw ourselves as a I suppose, a traditional science organization around providing the science facts to increase climate understanding. But we realized that was we were being left behind a little bit. And I think we also had more to say. And I think we also had our own commitments to our own net zero journey and wanted to show leadership in this space. So we've moved on and undertaking a fair amount of research on where is the best place to position the Met Office. Actually, we want to be an advisor and enabler, so helping others to make decisions and to take action on climate change. And we've really developed a narrative and positioning around this based on the fact that we are a scientific organization. We are doing, we have 400 scientists in the Met Office researching climate change, publishing 500 scientific, peer-reviewed scientific publications a year on climate science, a key contributor to the government's advice ahead of COP26. And the Met Office was at COP26 supporting the UK negotiators in their climate positioning. So we want to be really clear is that in our communications, the science is clear. The climate is changing. There's nothing disputable about that. But only the best climate science will enable us to bring the resilience we need to face the challenges for the future. And what we really need to do is link the facts with real life situations. So how is our weather changing on a day-to-day basis? What's the extreme weather we're likely to see? How more likely we're likely to see extreme rainfall or heat waves or smog situations, for example. And then using that information, we can help people and organizations prepare for the future, whether that's today's weather and those hazards I've already talked about, or making sure we're ready to deal with the climate environment that's yet to come. And we talk about this in this concept of getting climate ready. What we really need to be, though, as our organization is firstly impartial. And I think that's not only for ourselves as a science organization, I think it's really important for many, that we deliver the key facts and that information is backed up by the best science available. That we are trusted, that we make sure that we we build and nurture our reputation as a trusted world-class science provider. And then lastly, that we are influential, so we're willing to get stuck in to inform and validate the big decisions and make sure that we're helping governments, local government, business and society make the decisions they need to make. I wanted to just finish up by touching on a couple of things we're doing a little bit differently in the communication space. So obviously, as we did a lot of communications around COP26, but also in the run up to COP, we held a science conference in the middle of this year, and we're looking at a range of different communications techniques to push forward. So we've been engaging some kind of bringing science and the arts together in terms of generating some poems and poetry to really express climate change. But also we're working with Microsoft in a partnership to really bring climate futures into the Minecraft world. So you can go into Minecraft and you'll see our simulations of future climate. We've been regularly producing a Mostly Climate podcast. In the middle of last year, for a range of campaigns, we produced what is probably familiar for many people, a typical weather forecast, but what that weather forecast would look like in 2050. And then we've been engaging with youth. So in that top post, what can a 7-year-old now do to communicate on climate change? Because I think it's really important that, and actually being really positive in our messages, you're doing great. So we don't want to scare everyone. And lastly, looking at different ways of really visualizing the data, and that graphic in the middle shows how the world has warmed with individual pictures of, so back from 1919 to 2020, all those people within a person's lifetime, how our climate has warmed over the last 100 or so years. I just want to finish up with a little bit of advice and kind of what we've been taking forward in this space. So the first thing is, as I've talked about already, advise and enable. It's really about our role to help others make decisions and take action. But I think it's also really important that we walk the talk, that we lead the responses to to our changing climate and we don't just talk about it, we're actually seen to be taking action ourselves. I think it's really, really important that we avoid the greenwash. If it isn't helping tackling climate change, then really don't claim it is. We have to be really clear in our communications of the actions we're taking and how they're contributing to climate change. And not everything needs to be badged as an action on climate change. Be positive. I think it's really important that the need for action is urgent, undoubtedly, but it's not too late. And I think it's really important that we don't scare people into inaction. I think we can, or what's the word I'm looking for? Don't discourage people from believing that actions are already being taken. Whilst they may not be enough for some, there's still actions being taken. So whilst some may be disappointed with some of the outcomes of COP26, I think it's really important to recognise the steps that were made there. And then just lastly, it's really important, I think, you should expect from a scientific organisation like my own to make sure you're sticking to the evidence and making sure you're providing a robust, your information is based on robust information itself. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Dave. That was really fascinating. I didn't realise we had committed to some global warming. I'd missed that. So that was really interesting to hear. Yeah, so the way the climate system works, so all the CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases we've already pushed into the atmosphere will stay there for some time. So even if we stopped emitting CO2 today or any further greenhouse gases today, not that that is actually possible, but strictly speaking, if we could, we would still be committed to further warming, possibly as much as another couple decimal points of warming. I think it's up to half a degree of warming we're already committed to. Gosh, that's really interesting. We'll come back to questions from the wider audience in a moment. In the meantime, we're going to hand over to Louise Morton, who's going to talk about your council's response.
Just going to figure out how to share my screen. See if that works. Okay, let's try. Hi, I'm Louise Morton. I work for Surrey County Council and I have done for the last 2 years. So as Holly said at the beginning, we were one of a number of public sector organisations that declared a climate change emergency in July 2019. Then in April 2020, about 8 or 9 months later, just as we were heading into the first lockdown, we released Surrey's climate change strategy. I just want to note at that point that it was designed to be Surrey's climate change strategy, not Surrey County Council's. So we worked with the 11 districts and boroughs within Surrey to develop that, recognising that we can't do this in isolation, and to try and claim that we could would be somewhat foolish. So that strategy sets out 2 goals. One of them is to be net zero as an organisation by 2030, and then in line with the government target to be as a county net zero by 2050. And then in October this year, so 6 weeks ago, we went to Cabinet with our delivery plan. That sets out the actions and priorities for the next 5 years, so for the first 5 years of the strategy that will move us towards those goals. So the whole process has taken sort of about 18 months from declaring the strategy to having the delivery plan in place, which I think is quite good going, to be honest, given the complexity of the science and the fact that climate change touches nearly every single part of our lives. So it's very difficult to look at it individually. You need to look at it holistically. So there's quite a lot of number crunching to be done. And as I said in the introduction, obviously we've had a pandemic going on at the same time, which probably hasn't really helped. But one of the challenges for communications, I think, is that as soon as we declared a climate emergency, residents are expecting to see something, they're expecting to see action. And whilst we had the climate change strategy, until we have the delivery plan, it's very difficult to kind of concretely go out and say to residents, this is what we're doing. Or at least if we had, it probably would have been jumping the gun slightly, because clearly we want to make sure that we're making the right choices and the right decisions and the right priorities. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we weren't doing anything at all, I would like to say. There were some sort of programs that were already in place, like replacing streetlights with LED ones that had been in place anyway. And we already had a pilot to roll out electric vehicle chargers. So it's not that we haven't done anything at all, but it's been more complex to kind of go out to residents with any degree of clarity or full answer, because we just didn't have that information ourselves. And clearly we recognise that engaging residents is really important, because I'm sure Dom will touch on this later, but behaviour change is going to be critical to us achieving those goals. And actually, I think it's only about 1% of the county's emissions are within the council's control. So it's definitely not something that we can kind of sit and do on our own. We do need to bring residents on that journey with us. So last year, is that right, 2020, I forget which year we're in, it's all been a bit of a blur since we've been working from home. So noting that we didn't have a delivery plan in place, we recognised last summer that we needed to start doing something. So some of the things that we did, just to kind of trying to set that foundation, we created a little online widget which showed the average Surrey residents' carbon footprint, and that shows the breakdown of where emissions come from in people's lives. And this is kind of a little interactive tool online. It's still there, and it shows within that where those emissions come from. So there's a bit of an explanation, trying to break down the jargon that Dave was just talking about. So for example, in your household, it talks about the fact that the biggest emitters come from the heating and the lighting and then the energy used, and your food, where that comes from, air miles and things like that as well. So it gives you an explanation of what that is, what we're doing to address that, and then also gives you the resident top tips, but trying not to be too preachy, and also with a nod to recognising that some people don't always know what the best action is to do, addressing the greenwashing. We've tried to link to relevant sources of information to actually help people. We launched that through a kind of guerrilla marketing style social media campaign with little post-it notes and with little kind of factoids on them, taken in places relevant to what that fact was. So this was a kind of fun comms team lockdown activity of going around writing on post-it notes and taking photos in strange places like on trains, on trees, on bicycles, to try and promote the tool. We also launched a Commonplace website. For those of you who don't know, Commonplace is an online engagement platform which allows residents to kind of comment and provide feedback, and there's sort of a map feature. So we use that to start engaging residents and trying to get feedback from them on what our strategy was and what they thought our delivery plan needed to be. And we set up the process to start creating a climate change specific newsletter, which is now in place. So I think the first one didn't go out until early this year, but we started gathering the data, and the idea from that is to really try and work more closely with those early adopters, and sometimes some of those groups who one would traditionally see as lobbying against us. So we've been working with a lot of the Extinction Rebellion activists in Surrey and kind of trying to develop relationships with resident groups who are formed, and actually we found they want to work with us and they want our input and they want to know what's going on. So trying to develop closer working relationships with residents, again, it's that nod to acknowledging that they hold the key to our being able to achieve our goals. Not wanting to forget our employees. Obviously Surrey County Council has, I think, about 10 or 11,000 employees, and a lot of them actually live in Surrey, of course, as well. So not wanting to neglect those, we created an e-learning module for staff. We've had some really positive feedback on that, actually, and I think it's compulsory for new starters to do it as part of their induction suite of e-learning modules now, and we've been encouraging our pre-existing staff to complete that as well. And as I said, we've had some quite good feedback. That gives some basic introduction of what climate change is and the science behind it, and talks about the strategy and what we're trying to achieve. We've also created a hub in Jive, which again, for those who don't know, is our internal social networking tool. So this is just an online community where we talk about what we're doing in the climate change space. And the next step on from that is that we're going to be creating a Green Champions network internally to kind of gather staff together and provide that feedback up the chain, as well as disseminating information down to get ideas and inspiration from staff. And so far, whilst the Champions network isn't in place, whenever we post comments on Jive, we always get quite a lot of feedback and interaction. Not always positive, and some people are quite angry about things, but that's actually quite good. I think it shows that there's emotion and energy there, which I think we can harness in the right way. So earlier this year, I think Don might be quite interested in this, we did a whole bunch of research in preparation for the delivery plan that we launched in October. We held, I think it was 5 focus groups in May with different groups of residents. So I think there was some elderly people, some people with disabilities, some businesses, some younger people, and we also had a group that was specifically those people who would count themselves as climate change activists. And Dave, what your point was really interesting. One of the things that they said was there's a really low level of understanding around climate change and the science behind it, particularly with the jargon. So when we talk about being, net carbon zero, that's great. People don't really understand what it means. So there's a challenge for us in terms of communication of to how we overcome that, because I think people are quite baffled by it. Also, again, with what Dave said, that there was a sense that the climate change feels very far away. It's something that happens in the Arctic or in, the Amazon. It's not really something that happens in Surrey. And psychologically, we know that proximity to something does actually affect people's motivation and their sense of urgency. So there is a challenge for us that people don't really see it as being a problem that Surrey has, when actually, of course, it is. So we've been talking a little bit about sort of biodiversity and some of the wildfires that we've had over the last couple of years to try and make it seem very real for people, because it's just not really. There was a recognition from residents that they need to make lifestyle changes, but there was quite a lot of confusion. So they were open to having support from us. Interestingly, people tended to overestimate the benefit of the changes that they had already made. So they thought they were saving the planet by recycling or using, not using single-use plastic bags, which is great, but environmentally it doesn't actually have that much benefit. There was less of an appetite for making more significant and harder changes like being vegan or ditching the car. Even within those groups who said that they were climate change activists, they still were reluctant to make those really difficult changes. But people did say that they were prepared to make them. They felt that they needed incentives rather than penalties. So this gave us some really valuable information that residents are really telling us what they need. There is an appetite for change. They need help with motivation, and they need help with knowing what to do, which we felt as a council gives us the ideal opportunity to position ourselves as that kind of trusted source of information. And I think we're already in that space, particularly over the pandemic, because there's been a lot of misinformation online, that people see a public sector body as being someone that they can go to for trusted, reliable information. So we really want to harness that opportunity and provide them with more information. And we sort of started that with the online interactive tool that we created, again, giving people that link to information. So now we're trying to build on this. So some of the things that we've done this year in terms of, sort of direct communication, we've recreated our website and we've to create sort of a climate change hub, Surrey's Greener Future, and we've really developed this brand. So in line with, I guess, a lot of organisations, I think one of the challenges that we have is that some of the projects and programmes that we are delivering that relate to climate change aren't necessarily being delivered by the climate change team, just in an organisational structure. So that makes it complicated, because teams and programmes want to go out to residents and talk about what they've done. But what we want to do is make sure that from a resident's perspective, everything that the council is doing that has a benefit on climate change has that similar look and feel. So subconsciously residents start to associate it and build a full picture of everything that we're doing that has a climate change benefit, to really emphasise that we're doing a lot and that this is a really important subject. So we've rehashed our website and given it a really strong brand and identity and presence. And alongside that, over the summer, we ran this little social media campaign reminding people of all of the different projects and programs that we had been running anyway that have that climate change benefit. We did a solar panel offer over the summer, and we've, as I said, already done LED streetlights and EV chargers and things like that. And then building on the interactive tool, we've now launched a resident blog. So what we're doing is we're getting residents to write about changes, lifestyle changes that they've made, because again, from the research, we recognise that people don't always know what to do. So things like installing a heat pump, people don't know how to do that, or what it looks like. So what we wanted to do is provide information from residents. There's an element of kind of keeping up with the Joneses as well. So there's a little bit of competition. So if people say, oh, well, they've done it, so maybe we should be doing this as well. A little bit of peer pressure, but also building on that information to help encourage people to make that changes, looking at your behaviour change model. People need to know what are their barriers. And sometimes with climate change, their barriers to making changes is the lack of information. So we're trying to build on that by creating this body of knowledge that's written by residents, again, empowering that voice and sharing and amplifying that to encourage other residents to make similar changes. And we also created a video about our delivery plan, and that's with Tim Oliver, our leader, but we also had Sarah Chimbwandira, who's the Chief Executive of Surrey Wildlife Trust, and we had a resident feature in there as well. So again, what we're trying to do is showcase actually all of Surrey working together, not just the council on its own. So we're working with other organisations and we're working in partnership with residents to try and achieve those changes. And that the video was launched at the Surrey Hills AONB symposium a couple of weeks ago. They had a feature on climate change and biodiversity. So we spoke there, which was really fascinating. We were also lucky enough to be appointed to hold a COP event in Farnham in November. So that was live streamed on the day, and that was on a focus on transport in a rural county, because I think almost 50% of the emissions in Surrey come from transport, and over half of those are from private vehicles. So it's not just kind of HGVs and trucks and things, it is actually people driving in their cars. That's what's causing the emissions. And we've also got a couple of business focused initiatives. We are headline sponsor of Crest Business Awards, which is a business sustainability awards that was supposed to launch last year and for obvious reasons got postponed, but we're going to be doing it again next year. And that's proved really helpful as a way of also networking across the county and finding those businesses which are doing really great work in terms of becoming more eco, so we can promote and support them and use those as case studies and help other businesses. And tied to that, we're part of LowCase, which is EU regional development funding to provide grants to small businesses to make them more environmentally friendly. And then just to finish off, I think now we've got the delivery plan in place. The next steps was we've got the foundation of lots of tools, we've got our website in place, we've got various approaches set up. I think the next steps will be quite project by project and also place-based. I think one of the challenges with climate change is that you'll have different solutions work in different places. So transport's a really classic one. Solutions that would work in a town won't necessarily work in a rural area and vice versa. So you're going to have very individualized and specific solutions in different locations, and therefore the communications need to reflect that as well. And what works in one community might not necessarily work in another community. So I think the majority of our communications are going to be more place-based, project by project, and also working closely with residents, building on those relationships that we've established so far with those early adopters and those lobby groups who, maybe traditionally would work against us, but actually we've found that working with them has been really, really powerful and beneficial to us. That's what we've been doing so far. Thank you. Back to Holly.
That's great. Thanks so much, Louise. Some really creative approaches there, and you're getting a lot of love in the chat at the moment. So Mary Wenham says here, I live in Tandridge, so great to see the plan for Surrey. I love the Victoria Turton's going to be stealing your ideas by the looks of it. Said, I love the e-learning idea, might have to steal that for my organisation. And Mandy says lots of great hints and tips. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we've talked about behaviour change. Well, both of you've mentioned behaviour change, but now we're going to hand over to the behaviour change expert, Dom, who can talk us through it in more detail.
Right, thank you, Holly. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about behaviour change and how we can bring some of those principles to life. So there's lots of things that both Dave and Louise have said that I'm going to pick up on as I go through my presentation, because it's very much grounded in behavioural science and some of the things that we can do. Just to introduce myself, I run the Behaviour Change Network, work with organisations to run behaviour change campaigns and embed behaviour change principles, and also co-chair CIPR's local public services group. So just to say a little bit about the theory before I go into some examples of how to apply it. So lots of the theory around behaviour change is basically it comes from the notion that people do behave irrationally. And a lot of the theory is very much about how you bring predictability to what appears to be unpredictable human behaviour, a bit of scientific rigour, so thinking about what behaviours do we want to change, so taking a lot of the steps that Louise went through, thinking about what influences those behaviour and how can we be confident that what we do will actually shift people's behaviours in the right way. So actually, sorry, am I sharing the right screen? Am I sharing the screen with my notes on it, or?
No, you've got one here that says what affects decision making.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, I thought for a second I'd shared the wrong screen. Apologies. So yeah, so what affects decision making? So this is really important to think about, and I think I'll keep coming back to this point. And there was a question in the chat about it. So one of the biggest things to bear in mind is that that people do generally behave very emotionally. So something like 80% of decisions are driven by emotions. So it plays a big part in deciding what interventions to bring to bear. And also, there's lots of things, as Louise said, that what people around us think, all that kind of thing, our beliefs, socioeconomic status, and cognitive biases, which I'll come back to in a second. So one thing that's quite important is thinking through the context. So when you're thinking about how do people make decisions, when are they making decisions, what is the context? That's important when you're deciding your interventions. So if, for example, you are trying to reduce food waste, and I'll come back to this, that could potentially be a much quicker decision. People are kind of doing it in an automatic way. It's intuitive. They aren't really thinking about what they're doing. If they're going into the fridge, grabbing something on the way to work, I mean, not so much these days, but that decision will be important when kind of going into the office comes back again. Where something like installing a new heating system, that's much more of a kind of slower, deliberate thought process. So how people think and make decisions is very different. So if we take the example of fast automatic decisions, we make something like 35,000 decisions in a day. So when we need to design behaviour attention interventions in this context, we really need to grab people's attentions because we're competing against lots of other decisions. So the thing to bear in mind is that as human beings, we use mental shortcuts, which lead to cognitive biases. So a lot of the time we want to make rational choices, but we're subject to cognitive limitations. We use mental shortcuts that lead to these biases. So they're helpful because if we didn't have these biases, we couldn't get by in making decisions during the day, but there are errors that we make. So lots of them you will be familiar with, these kind of unconscious errors that we make, that we do during the day, and that helps us to make decisions more quickly. So it's our brain trying to simplify the world around us. So a good example of that is confirmation bias. So we place much more value on information that supports our existing beliefs. So that's something that Dave in particular will be only too well aware of. So a lot of the time, the challenge for us is as comms people is to get that information across from people that we know, like and trust. So particularly people locally, giving out that information makes a big difference. Anchoring bias is another one. So we're much more heavily influenced by the first piece of information we receive. And organisations like McDonald's have used this to good effect when they ran a randomised control trial where they put the healthy options first on their touchscreen menu, and that resulted in lots more people choosing that option to eat. So that makes a big difference, and a couple of examples of how to overcome those biases. So in terms of approach, so how do you approach this? Well, as Louise said, I won't repeat what she said, but there's a good place to start is really to think about the kind of impact of all your different actions and how that affects climate change, and then look at behavioural frameworks to have a think about where you can change people's behaviour. So things you can do at home, travel choices you can make, food waste, recycling, all that kind of things, as well as some of the bigger modifications you can make to your home, like having solar panels, solar pumps, all that kind of thing. So the good news is that people often want to do the right thing, but we need to work with them to overcome those barriers to change. And I think Eva in the chat had a question which I'll come back to again, but one of the things that we can certainly do is cost is a great motivator. So the savings you make from climate change actions, sometimes they can be a bigger motivator and get people to do the right thing, rather than just telling them what to do and the effect that that has on climate change. So here's some of the frameworks that we can use. So there's 2 frameworks in particular that are useful to think about how we can shift people's behaviour: the EAST framework and the COM-B framework. And I also work with organisations to help them plan campaigns through my own BEST framework. So let's talk very briefly about, so the EAST framework, if you haven't come across it, it's really useful to think about what it is that we can do to shift people's behaviour. And what Louise was talking about is very much using that model and how we can think about what will actually achieve that shift. So it's a 4-part model. So it's things like there's 4 parts to it, basically making it as easy as possible for people to pick the behaviour you want them to, so making it as easy as possible to take climate friendly action. Attractive is very much around attracting people's attention. So as I was saying earlier, we make a lot of decisions during the day, so we really need to grab people's attention. We're heavily influenced by what others around us say, and when we deliver that message really matters. The COM-B model, so do Google that. That is a really useful way to think about how you start addressing those barriers, and how you can get people to do the right thing. So time or knowledge can be a big constraint. So obviously, sometimes just telling people what to do can be enough, giving them the right facts. So particularly the work that the Met Office is doing can make a big difference, but also thinking about when you deliver that message, and this is really key. So if you want someone to make modifications to their home, think about when will their behaviour most likely be disrupted. So for instance, when you move house, that is the time that you're most likely to change energy supplier or think about putting in new measures to basically tackle that kind of inertia. So it's really important to think about that. Also motivation, so thinking about what is the habit you're trying to change and how you can change people's habits there. And then opportunity, so as Louise was saying in particular, there's lots of opportunities to shift people's behaviour based on social norms, so what other people around you think and how you have the right messenger. So this is a good way to start that process. So in your campaigns, what you may want to do, if you're from a local authority in particular, is think about which of those easier to move behaviours and which of those harder to move ones. So getting people to change to a green energy tariff, reducing dairy consumption, or take more sustainable travel options is going to be much easier to focus on than getting them to modify their house, avoid flights, or install renewable energy options. So I'm just going to go through the 4 steps of the EAST model, just to give you an example of some of the things that you can think about doing depending on the behavioural intervention. So making it easy, which is all about, as it says, making it as easy as possible for people to take the right choice. We're all cognitively lazy, but we need a bit of a hand to turn that into reality. So doing things like installing cup washers in cafes is a good example of how you can make it easier for people to bring their own mugs. I've already talked about McDonald's, but also things like having more sustainable plant-based foods as the default choice. So potentially, say at a catered event, you have to actively choose to switch to red meat because the plant-based food is the default choice. Also thinking about how you can work with DIY providers, combining it with a loft clearance service, that kind of thing. So it makes it easy for people to choose that option and then install loft insulation off the back of a loft clearance service. So here's a good example of how to tackle food waste. So this is all about thinking, how do you make it as easy as possible? So when you go into the fridge, it's that kind of, there's the thought process that a lot of the time, if you're doing things quickly, you might just grab food out of the fridge. So thinking about how you can change that context. So having messages around the fridge, doing things where you ask people to trust their senses. So if it looks out of date, then it probably is out of date. That's a good rule of thumb. Obviously it doesn't work for chicken, but works well with fruits and veg and things like that. Also doing things like encouraging people to have an eat soon shelf with stickers on it, getting kids involved who can be quite active advocates for this kind of thing. That again makes it really easy for people to do the right things. So moving it on to making it attractive. So we're drawn to things that get our attention and are appealing. So this isn't just about pretty design. So I do a lot of work around waste and recycling, and just a simple thing like making a recycling bin much more attractive outside and in your home makes a big difference to whether you recycle or not. Also avoiding terms like vegetarian and meat-free, so that it's refined as, say, spicy chickpea curry, is a good way of thinking about how you can overcome those barriers. Repair cafes, again, that's the kind of thing where the more you're providing social interaction, other people around you doing the same thing, taking climate change friendly actions will make a big difference. So as Dave pointed out in particular earlier, I think with the Minecraft example, gamifying or competing with others makes a big difference. It attracts people's attention. As Louise said, if you have a bit of competition, that does make a big difference as to whether people engage. Also doing things like publicly displaying sustainability ratings, so how much you've saved in terms of food waste, and having some sort of rating system. That's a really good way to bring this into practice. And then also discounting for the future is quite a big one, especially if you're getting people to make changes to their home with quite expensive interventions. So often what you'll find is, even though in the future you may have long-term gains, a small reward now makes a big difference. And that encourages people to take up the behaviour change now rather than in the future. So making it social. So this is really important. So with social norms, localised messages make a big difference, because the more you localise it, the more that people will take climate friendly actions. So one of the problems is that climate change can seem quite distant and remote. So the more you localise messages and highlight what everyone else is doing, the more that people will think, actually, I can make a difference locally. So showing who else around you is reducing dairy consumption, reducing meat consumption, all that basic comms around case studies makes a big difference. And to answer one of the questions in the chat, so pride, sense of pride, fun, humour, all those kinds of things, as well as the money you save, can make a big difference to whether people take up action. So rather than scaring people, as Dave said, or using messages around guilt, it's those positive messages that can make a much bigger difference and encourage people to do the right thing. So yeah, make it timely. So as I said earlier, thinking about when people make a decision about the behaviour you're trying to shift, that has a big impact on whether or not they'll adopt what you want them to do. So think about when normal routines are disrupted, or also when people will change energy supplier, and also things like if you're organising events or something like that, asking people to pre-order food will make a big difference, because they're much more likely to make healthy food choices because they've got more time to think about it. So when you're time poor and you're making a quick decision, you're much more likely to pick bad food options. And that's something I do with my kids all the time. When I've kind of come home from work or at the end of the day and I'm thinking, what am I going to put together? I'll quickly just use chips and burgers and things like that because it's in the fridge, but it's a quicker thing to do. But at the time I'm time poor, which is why I'm making those decisions. But actually, I do want to meet more healthily. So with a bit more time, I'd make those decisions. So that's a brief run through of some of the things that we can all do to make a difference. So I run various workshops and help with campaigns, so do get in touch. And if you want to sign up to my email newsletter, do scan that QR code. And thank you for listening.
That's great, Dominic. Thank you. That was really helpful. I have had to laugh though. Mary's put in the chat, getting my husband to read the use by dates is the biggest challenge. I can definitely identify with that one.
So yeah, there's just on that, on a serious point, there's a good trial where I forget where it was now, but what they did is I think they just had one sticker on food. So because there's the use by and there's so many different dates, it's difficult to know which one to read at times. So just making that easier does make a big difference.
Yeah, I really like your idea about, you know, sort of like eat now or eat within a week sorts of stickers. I think that's something definitely I'll be adopting. Right then, so we've come to the end of our presentations. We've got about 8 minutes now before the end of this event. For any questions, does anyone have any questions they'd like to pose to the panelists? Right, I've got Tim who's just put here a really interesting session. Thanks for some really good examples of applying this in practice. In terms of audience, which group do the panel, panel say are the hardest to reach and persuade? Those who do not want to listen, either deniers or because of individual obstacles such as income, or those who think they're already doing the right thing. Right, open it up to the panel.
I can go first if.
Right, I think that sounds like a plan.
Yeah. I mean, I think from a behavioural point of view that if people are doing the right thing already, they're motivated and want to do the right thing. So it's going to be easier to shift those people. So if you've got someone who's a committed recycler, for instance, and is putting their drinks carton and it's contaminated with food into the recycling, they'll be easier to shift because they're already doing the right thing. So getting them to move will be easier. So I think always those people I would start with first, the ones who are motivated and want to do the right thing. And then I think the ones that are going to be hardest to move are always going to be the ones who don't want to do the right thing. But also I think in behavioural terms, it can often be about motivation and stuff like that. So if it's a case of having to spend lots of money on solar panels and stuff like that, that's a difficult thing to do, whether or not you're motivated or not. So that's always going to be harder to shift. Okay,
that's really helpful. Right, have we got any other questions coming through? Can't see any hands. Can we see any hands?
I was going to say, Dave, were you going to come in on that point just now?
I think, I mean, we have some interesting conversations here about not necessarily around action, but about how we drive an understanding around the climate science. And I think sometimes there's a danger that both climate change can be quite polarized, and actually those who are, you know, outright deniers of the climate science and climate change are very hard on, you know, if you talked about kind of sitting in their little bubble and I don't think we'll ever move. Similarly, there's others that I think at the other end, in the activist space, that I think can be equally challenging because I think they can scare or over exaggerate the situation. And it's not to say that urgent action isn't needed, it is. But I think it's really important that we recognise that steps are being made. So you take the actions were taken, such as the protests on the M25, etc. Does that do more harm than good in terms of driving further action, or does it just actually turn people off the debate? And I think there's some really interesting things to look at in that space. So, like Louise said, and she's been engaging with Extinction Rebellion and other activist groups. We've been doing the same in the Met Office, and we've actively worked with them to help explain the science and the detail around climate change, so that we can counter some of the more extremist claims sometimes they're made, so we can have a more honest debate around climate change. And I think that's really, really important. So I think it sits at both ends.
I think it's really interesting. I think definitely engaging with activists ensures that you've got a balanced view.
And I think it touches on this in this scare point, which I think came up. I made, and then someone was asked a question, I think earlier in the conversation, about any tips on how not to scare people. I'm not quite sure I know completely the answer, apart from just for us, it's all about maintaining the integrity of our communications and being, maintaining the scientific authority of what we talk about. And also always recommend that there is action to take, that there are things big or small that you can do, whether you're a member of the public, whether you're a local council, whether you're an industry, or whether you're government. There's always something you can do.
That's really good. Louise, so we've had a direct question for you. How much support have you had from the boroughs and districts for promoting the work on climate change? Have you created any joint assets, and how did that work for you in Surrey?
That's a good question. I'm going to say mixed, probably. I think when we were initially trying to create the strategy, we had, we had more interest from some of the Ds and Bs than we did from others. I'm not wanting to be critical, and this genuinely isn't. I think there's a resource issue, and also to develop the strategy, we worked with Professor Andy Goldson from Leeds University, and I don't think all of the Ds and Bs had sufficient budget and resources to be able to do the same. So in reality, I guess being able to then work together makes sense. We haven't got to the point where we've started to create joint assets. We do have a system of sharing assets across Surrey anyway, so that we kind of cross-promote campaigns. I think when we get down to that, as I said at the end, that kind of more localised approach on a project-by-project basis, we'll start working with the Ds and Bs in more detail. We have a comms link in, and there's also across the climate change offices, there's a connection there as well. I think as we move forward, we'll start to work with them on a kind of closer basis. Certainly, for example, we've got a huge infrastructure programme going on in Farnham at the moment, and a lot of that's led by problems with air quality and congestion. So though it's not a climate change project, it has a very strong climate change drive and kind of key messages through there. And in that particular instance, of course, we're working very, very closely with both Waverley and Farnham Town Council. So I think it's when you've got those localised approaches, we'll be working very closely with those local DSBs in the relevant areas. But yeah, it's been a bit of a mixed bag, but I think that's just a symptom of what else is going on at the moment, to be honest.
Yeah, most definitely. There's a lot of stuff going on in local authority at the moment. Okay, have we got any more questions from anyone? No? Well, this may be the first event that's ever closed on time that I've chaired, so I'm quite proud of this. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Dominic, Dave and Louise. So today is worth 5 CPD points for CIPR, so please don't forget to log your points. And this is also part of a series of events. The last one is in the next couple of days, which is about Jersey and how they are approaching climate change in Jersey and their roadmap. So it's worth booking onto as well. Details are on the CIPR website. Again, I'd like to say a huge thanks to all of our panelists today, and thank you to everyone for your time. Right, goodbye.
Yeah,
Cheers,
thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.